I watched my husband fling crumpled bills at my feet like I was some cheap dancer in front of his laughing friends, never once guessing that his precious fortune was about to vanish because of me. The poker chips were still clicking against the table when Grant stood up and reached into his back pocket. It was a Friday night in October, the kind of crisp Charlotte evening where the windows stayed cracked an inch for the smell of the neighbor's fireplace. Colton Marsh was mid-laugh at something Beckett Hale had said. The television in the den was playing an NFL replay nobody was watching. I was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, holding a stack of folded dish towels because I'd just come to ask Grant if he could hand me $60 for groceries before the store closed. $60, Grant repeated, like I'd asked him for a kidney. He pulled a fold of bills from his pocket, thumbed through them, and peeled off 3 20s. Then, instead of holding them out to me, he flicked his wrist and let them drop. They didn't glide. They crumpled and fell in an uneven scatter across the hardwood, one landing near the leg of the poker table, one skidding almost under the couch. There you go, baby. Go do your thing. He grinned at Colton like they were sharing a private joke. I stood there for a second too long. Beckett let out a low whistle and said, "Damn, Grant, you tip better than that at the strip club." The room laughed. Grant laughed loudest. I remember the exact sound of it, a short, satisfied bark, like he'd told a joke he was proud of. I knelt down on the floor in my kitchen in front of 3 grown men and picked up $20 bills one at a time. My knees found the cold hardwood. My face found the kind of heat that has nothing to do with the fireplace. Colton wouldn't meet my eyes. Beckett kept laughing into his beer. Grant had already turned back to the table, already dealing the next hand, already forgetting I existed the moment the bills left his hand. "You're a good sport, Mara," he said, not even looking at me. "That's why I married you." I stood up with $60 folded in my fist and walked to the car without saying a word. I remember gripping the steering wheel in the driveway for almost a full minute before I turned the key, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror, a 32-year-old woman who used to run a marketing team of 11 people and now couldn't buy groceries without kneeling for it first. That was the night I stopped telling myself it would get better. It was also, though I didn't know it yet, the beginning of the end of everything Grant Calloway thought he owned. I met Grant Calloway in March of 2017 at a charity gala for the Charlotte Regional Business Alliance. I was 26, working in marketing for a mid-sized architecture firm, wearing a dress I'd bought on sale for the occasion. He was 35, already a name in commercial real estate, the kind of man who got introduced by his job title before his first name. "This is Grant Calloway. He just closed the Sycamore Ridge development." People said it like it meant something, and back then, I let it mean something too. He was funny that first night, sharp, attentive, the kind of man who remembered the name of the bartender and tipped him $50 just to watch his face light up. He called me the next morning at 9, which felt old-fashioned and thrilling. Within 4 months, he was talking about forever. Within a year, I was engaged, and Vivian Calloway, his mother, had already picked out 3 venues she wanted us to consider without asking either of us. We married in May of 2018 at a vineyard outside Asheville. 200 guests. An open bar that cost more than my old annual salary. My sister Dana was my maid of honor. She hugged me in the bridal suite before the ceremony and said, "He looks at you like you're the only person in the room. Don't lose that." I promised her I wouldn't. Our honeymoon was in Providenciales, in the Turks and Caicos. 10 days at a resort Grant had gotten a corporate discount on through a client. On the 4th day, we wandered through a strip of vendor stalls near the marina. I found a beaded bracelet, hand-strung, $40, sold by a woman who told me she'd made it herself that morning. I asked Grant for the cash. He was scrolling through emails on his phone, already half back in Charlotte in his head, already thinking about a deal that was closing that week. He didn't even look up. He pulled 2 20s from his wallet and let them fall from his fingers onto the sandy pavement between us. The vendor's eyes flicked down, then up at me, then away. The particular kind of away that means someone has seen something they wish they hadn't. I picked the bills up off the ground and handed them to her, my face burning under the Caribbean sun, and told myself it was stress. Big trip, big spending, jet lag, 100 emails piling up back home. I told myself a lot of things that week. None of them were true. That was the first time. I didn't know yet it would become a pattern, a rhythm, a language he'd use with me for the next 6 years. Grant made real money, the kind that shows up in a house with a 3-car garage and a home office with a view of the golf course. But the money was never ours. It was his, administered to me in pieces, on his terms, in his timing. 2 weeks after the wedding, he sat me down at the kitchen island with a legal pad and a serious expression. "I've been thinking," he said. "You don't need to keep grinding at the firm. Let me take care of everything. You focus on us, on the house, on whatever makes you happy." I remember feeling grateful. I remember thinking I'd married a man secure enough to want to provide. What he meant, I understood only in hindsight, was that he wanted to control everything. "Within 3 months of quitting my job, my name came off our joint checking account for tax reasons," he said. "I never saw a bank statement again. I had no credit card in my name. Every dollar that reached me came from his hand, and increasingly it came the way it had in Providenciales. Flicked, dropped, scattered, like I was something to be paid off rather than someone to be provided for. There was an earlier warning I should have understood better than I did. 6 months into the marriage, in November of 2018, Grant's father, Harold Calloway, passed away suddenly from a heart attack at 61. At the funeral reception, Vivian pulled me aside, dabbing her eyes, and said something that struck me as strange even then. Harold kept things from me for 30 years and told me it was was for my own protection. Grant's the same way. It's how Callaway men love. I laughed it off as grief talking. I filed it away instead of understanding it as a blueprint. There was a second warning, smaller, easier to miss, that came a year later. For our first anniversary in May of 2019, Grant surprised me with a weekend in Charleston, a boutique hotel on the water, a reservation at a restaurant I'd mentioned once, months earlier, in passing. I remember being genuinely moved, thinking, this is the man I married, this is the version of him that shows up when it matters. On the second night, at dinner, I ordered a glass of wine that cost $19, and Grant flagged the waiter down before it even arrived and switched it for the house pour instead, $7, without asking me, without a word of explanation, just a small, decisive correction made on my behalf. When I asked him about it later, back in the hotel room, he laughed and said I was being dramatic, that he was just being practical, that the house wine was basically the same thing. It wasn't about the $12. It was the first time I understood, in some wordless way I couldn't yet articulate, that even in a weekend built entirely around celebrating me, Grant still needed to be the one holding the final say over what I was allowed to want. I brought it up again months later, half joking, testing the water to see if he remembered it the way I did. He didn't remember it at all. You're inventing things now, he said, not unkindly, more amused than anything, like I told him a story about a dream I'd had. That was the first time I understood something else, too. Something that would define the next 5 years of my marriage far more than the wine ever could. Grant didn't just control what I received. He controlled what I was allowed to remember about how I'd received it. By our second anniversary, the pattern had a shape. Groceries meant $100 tossed onto the kitchen counter, sometimes onto the floor if he was mid-conversation on the phone. Gas money got flicked into my lap while he watched football, never once pausing the game to look at me. New clothes meant bills scattered across the comforter, like he was some rap video extra making it rain, and he'd laugh at his own joke every single time. There's my girl, he'd say. Go treat yourself. As if being handed $40 flung across a bedspread was a treat, and not a small, repeated humiliation dressed up as generosity. The first real crack came at a dinner party in September of 2020, the Whitcomb's place. 6 couples around a table set with the kind of china you only bring out for company. My sister's 40th birthday was coming up in 3 weeks, and I mentioned quietly that I needed to grab a gift and maybe pitch in for the dinner Dana's husband was planning. I asked Grant, low enough that I thought only he'd hear, if I could get $80 for it. He didn't lower his voice back. Here you go, sweetheart, he said, peeling bills from his money clip and dropping them onto my plate, right next to my unfinished salmon, like I was a stray dog he was tossing scraps to. The table went quiet for half a second, and then, because that's what people do, they laughed. Somebody's husband said, at least he's generous. And the table moved on to the next topic like nothing had happened. I picked the bills up off my plate that night with oil and lemon butter on my fingers and said nothing. In the car afterward, I finally said something. You embarrassed me back there. Grant's face changed instantly. That particular shift I'd come to recognize but hadn't yet named. Embarrassed you? I gave you money in front of my friends and you're mad? Do you know how that sounds? You're being sensitive, Mara. Everyone thought it was funny. You're the only one who's making it into something. That was the first tool he used on me, though I didn't have a name for it then. Gaslighting doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, dressed as reasonableness, and it makes you doubt the thing you just watched happen with your own eyes. I went to bed that night rehearsing the scene over and over, trying to figure out if I actually had overreacted. By morning, I'd apologized to him for making a big deal out of nothing. He accepted my apology like it was owed to him. I stopped asking for money in front of people after that. I started asking privately, quietly, in the kitchen, at night, timing it for when he was in a good mood. But privacy didn't change the mechanics. It just changed the audience. By the spring of 2021, I'd decided to try something different. I told Grant I wanted to open my own small checking account, separate from the household money, just so I could budget without asking him for every last item. I framed it carefully, the way you learn to frame things with someone who takes offense easily. It's not about trust, I said. It's about not bothering you with every little thing. Grant didn't yell. He did something worse. He called his mother. Vivian showed up 2 days later for what she called a coffee visit and spent 40 minutes explaining to me, gently, the way you'd explain something to a child, that a marriage where the wife kept separate money was a marriage already halfway to divorce. Harold and I never had separate accounts, she said. Not once in 34 years. You have to trust your husband with everything, Mara. Or what are you even doing this for? She said it kindly. She said it like a gift. It took me another 2 years to understand it as a wall Grant had built using his own mother as the bricks. I dropped it. Grant never brought up the account again. Not because he forgot, but because he didn't need to. He'd already won, and he'd done it without raising his voice, without a single dollar bill hitting the floor. He'd simply recruited someone I loved to make his argument for him, and it worked better coming from her than it ever could have coming from him. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description, for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The third escalation came dressed as sympathy. In January of 2022, I pushed harder than I ever had before. I told Grant I wanted a credit card in my own name, even a small one, even one he could monitor, just so I'd have some kind of financial footprint if anything ever happened to him. I dressed it up as responsible planning. I even printed out an article about the importance of women maintaining independent credit. Grant sat across from me at the kitchen island and put his head in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "You have no idea what it's like," he said, voice cracking, "carrying everything. Every deal, every investor call, every employee who needs their paycheck to clear. I am drowning, Mara, and you're asking me to add one more thing to worry about. I thought you were the one place I didn't have to perform." He looked so genuinely wounded that I spent the next hour comforting him instead of getting my answer. I rubbed his back. I told him I was sorry for adding pressure. I made him tea. It wasn't until much later, staring at bank records with a forensic account, that I understood how absurd that performance had been. Grant wasn't drowning. In January of 2022, according to records Desmond Cruz would later pull, Grant's firm closed a mixed-use development deal worth $11 million, and his personal draw that quarter alone was $240,000. He wasn't drowning. He was performing a man who was drowning, because a drowning man doesn't have to give his wife a credit card. A drowning man gets to keep every dollar exactly where he wants it. The fourth escalation was the one that finally scared me enough to start planning in earnest. In the summer of 2022, I had a health scare, a lump that turned out benign after 2 agonizing weeks of waiting. But during that stretch, I needed to see a specialist outside our insurance network, an out-of-pocket cost of $1,100 for the imaging alone. Grant paid it, but he made sure I understood in the days after exactly what that payment had cost me in leverage. "You know I'll always take care of you," he said one night, sliding into bed beside me. "That's what a husband does. But you've got to stop making these little moves behind my back, Mara. The separate account thing, the credit card thing. It makes me feel like you're planning to leave. And if you're planning to leave, I need to know that. Because a man doesn't keep paying for imaging and lawyers and everything else for someone who's already got one foot out the door." He said it softly. He said it like concern, but I understood the shape of the sentence perfectly. My own health, my own body, had just been used as collateral in an argument about my obedience. I stopped pushing after that. For nearly a year, I went quiet, and Grant mistook my silence for surrender. He started leaving his home office door open more often, careless in the specific way people get when they believe they've already won. It was in that office, in March of 2023, dusting a bookshelf I rarely touched, that I first saw the folder. It was tucked between 2 hardcover books on commercial zoning law, a plain manila folder with a single word written on the tab, in Grant's cramped handwriting, Sorensen. I didn't open it. I didn't even really register it as strange in the moment, just a work folder among 100 other work folders. I only remembered it later, months later, when the name Sorensen would come back into my life and detonate everything I thought I understood about my marriage. The fifth and final escalation was the one where Grant stopped pretending to be subtle at all. In late 2023, after the poker night where he threw $60 at my feet in front of Colton and Beckett, I made one more attempt. I asked calmly, over breakfast, if we could talk to a financial advisor together, just to get a clearer picture of our combined assets. Something reasonable, something any married couple might do. Grant put down his coffee mug hard enough that it rattled the saucer. "Why do you need a clearer picture? What exactly are you trying to find, Mara?" His voice had an edge I'd never heard directed at me before, something closer to what I imagined he sounded like across a negotiating table with a man trying to underpay him for land. "I built this. I built every bit of it before you and I put a ring on your finger. You want a clearer picture? Get a job. Earn your own picture." I didn't argue. I nodded, apologized for bringing it up during breakfast, and went back to my coffee like nothing had happened. Inside, something had already shifted permanently. I had spent 5 years being told, in 100 small ways, that the money was his, and I was lucky to receive whatever fell from his hand. That morning was the first time he'd said it in words that plain. The tactics compounded after that, stacking on top of each other rather than replacing one another. Grant started keeping the good car, the one with reliable air conditioning and a working navigation system, parked at the office most weekdays, leaving me the older sedan that stalled twice that winter in a Harris Teeter parking lot. When I mentioned it needed a new battery, he said he'd look into it and never did. And I learned to time my errands around a car that might or might not start. He began asking, casually at first, and then not so casually, who I'd been texting when my phone lit up during dinner, glancing at the screen from across the table in a way that made me start turning it face down before he sat down at all. When my college roommate, Rosalind, invited me to visit her in Richmond for a weekend that November, Grant didn't forbid it outright. He simply asked, with a wounded softness I recognized by then as a tool rather than a feeling, "Is this really the best time, with everything going on at the firm? I could really use you here." I canceled the trip. I told Rosalind I wasn't feeling well. I have not seen her in person since. Looking back, I understand now that isolation rarely announces itself as isolation. It arrives as a car that never gets fixed, a weekend trip that never quite feels like the right time, a phone glanced at from across a table until you start hiding it yourself before anyone's even asked you to. By the time I sat across from Grant at that breakfast in late 2023 and heard him tell me to go earn my own picture, I had already spent the better part of a year without a single overnight visit to anyone who loved me and didn't answer to him first. It was the morning I stopped hoping things would get better and started quietly, methodically, planning my way out. I gave myself 8 months. I'd already started the groundwork the year before, but that breakfast conversation was the moment the plan stopped being a private fantasy and became a countdown. 3 years earlier, in 2021, while Grant slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a man man who has never once questioned whether the ground beneath him is solid. I had started teaching myself bookkeeping. I did it at the kitchen island at midnight with the volume on my laptop turned all the way down, working through online courses meant for people trying to start small businesses. By the fall of 2022, I had a bookkeeping certification and a small, growing list of freelance clients, mostly local contractors and one dog groomer who paid me in cash and referrals. I opened an account at a credit union across town in Matthews, 20 minutes from our house, somewhere Grant had no reason to ever set foot. Every freelance dollar went straight there. I never touched it, never let the balance show up anywhere Grant might glimpse it, never bought so much as a coffee with that card in front of him. Grant believed, as far as I could tell, that my days were spent cleaning the house and waiting for his calendar to open up for me. He never asked what I did with my time. That, more than anything else, was what let me disappear so completely without him noticing. By July of 2024, I had $18,000 saved, enough for a security deposit, 3 months of rent on a modest one-bedroom, and a retainer for a lawyer. I found Sawyer Kent through a referral from a woman in my old marketing circle who'd gone through her own divorce 2 years prior. I met him once, quietly. On a lunch break, I told Grant was a dentist appointment and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, then said the sentence that made me finally believe I wasn't crazy. "This is a pattern of economic abuse. You understand that, right? What you're describing has a name." I left on a Tuesday morning in August, while Grant was at a closing in Rock Hill that would keep him out until evening. I packed only what belonged to me, 2 suitcases and a box of books. Nothing from the house, nothing that could ever be argued as his. I left my wedding ring on the kitchen counter. Next to it, I laid out cash, every dollar I could account for, that he had thrown at me that month, counted out exactly to the dollar, folded neatly instead of crumpled. My note said 4 words: keep the change. He called 4 hours later, and I let it ring twice before I answered, mostly to see if my hands would shake. They didn't. "You are nothing without me," he said, his voice already climbing toward a register I'd never heard from him, something unhinged underneath the polish. "You understand that, right? You have no job, no credit, no money, nothing. You think you're going to survive out there without me? You'll be back in a week begging." I hung up while he was still talking and blocked his number before I set the phone down. Sawyer took one look at the bank statements I'd managed to photograph over the years. Screenshots of the joint account I could no longer access. Records of every withdrawal, every deposit, every quarterly draw Grant had bragged about at dinner parties. "This is worse than I thought," he said. "I want to bring in a forensic accountant before we file anything. I want the full picture before Grant knows we're looking." Desmond Cruz was a quiet, precise man who spoke in the careful cadence of someone who has learned that numbers, unlike people, never lie to you on purpose. He spent 6 weeks pulling threads. What he found, even in that first pass, made Sawyer go still on our phone call, the kind of stillness that made my stomach drop before he even spoke. Grant had been hiding money for years. There was an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, opened in 2019, funneling roughly $40,000 a year out of reach of any joint filing. There were 3 shell companies registered in Delaware, holding companies with names that meant nothing to me, existing solely to receive consulting fees from deals Grant closed and to make that income invisible to both the IRS and to me. None of this was declared, Desmond told me over the phone, his voice flat with the particular disbelief of a man who has seen a great deal of financial dishonesty and still finds some of it impressive. "Not on your joint returns. Not anywhere. Your husband has been building a second financial life for at least 5 years, Mara, running parallel to the one he showed you." Grant's response to being served was immediate and physical. He showed up at my apartment complex at 11 at night in early September, pounding on my door hard enough that a neighbor 2 units down cracked their door open to watch. "Open this door, you thief!" he shouted, loud enough that I could hear him through the wall over my own heartbeat. "You think you can just take my money and disappear? I will ruin you." I called the police with my hands shaking so badly I had to say my address twice. They arrived within 11 minutes and led him off my porch in handcuffs while 3 sets of neighbors watched from cracked doors and darkened windows. A judge granted me an emergency protective order within the week, and a permanent one a month after that. Following a hearing where Grant sat across the courtroom glaring at me like I was the one who'd broken something, Vivian called 2 days after the police report. She was crying before I even said hello. "You're destroying this family," she said. "Do you understand what you're doing to him, to us?" I told her calmly exactly what her son had done. I told her about the bills at my feet, about kneeling on my own kitchen floor in front of his friends, about 6 years of being handed money like I was a beggar outside a restaurant instead of his wife. There was a long silence on the line. Then she said, "That's just how men show affection, Mara. Harold was the same way. You learn to live with it." I hung up the phone and didn't answer her calls again for months. Grant violated the protective order twice in October, once by showing up at the grocery store I frequented and standing near the entrance until an employee asked him to leave, once by having Colton Marsh deliver a handwritten letter to my apartment door, begging me to stop this before it goes too far. Each violation went straight to Sawyer, who filed a motion each time, and each motion made the judge's patience visibly thinner. Meanwhile, Desmond kept digging, and the number kept climbing. What started as an estimated $300,000 in undisclosed assets became $500,000 by mid-October. Grant's attorney, a sharp, exhausted-looking woman named Priya Anand, reached out to Sawyer twice trying to negotiate a quiet, small settlement, hoping to close the whole thing before anyone outside the 4 of us ever saw the real numbers. I told Sawyer no both times. I wanted the truth on the record, in a courtroom, where Grant's business partners and his golf buddies and everyone who had ever laughed while I picked bills up off a floor could hear in detail exactly what kind of man they'd been laughing alongside for years. We sat across from each other at mediation on a Tuesday in late October, a long conference table between us at Sawyer's firm downtown. Grant walked in wearing a suit I recognized, tapping the face of an $18,000 watch like he had somewhere better to be. He barely glanced at me when Sawyer laid the first bank statement on the table between us. By the third statement, his jaw had gone tight enough that a muscle jumped near his ear. By the fifth, I watched his hands, folded on the table, begin to tremble slightly. Priya asked for a 15-minute break. Through the thin conference room wall, I heard Grant's voice rise and crack, catching on a single word. Ruined. He kept saying it. Ruined, ruined, ruined. Like a man discovering gravity for the first time. The final hearing was set for a Thursday in November. The night before, Desmond called me at 9:15, and something in his voice was different, tighter than his usual clinical calm. I found something else, he said. Something bigger than the offshore account, bigger than the shell companies. You need to see this before tomorrow morning. I asked him what it was, my whole chest going cold in a way I couldn't yet explain to myself. He was quiet for 3 full seconds, an eternity over the phone. Then he said one name, Sorensen. I remembered the folder instantly, the one I'd seen a year and a half earlier tucked between hardcover books in Grant's home office, the plain manila tab in his cramped handwriting. My phone buzzed with an incoming file before Desmond could explain another word, and I opened it with hands that had gone completely numb. Sorensen Consulting LLC had been registered in Delaware in January of 2020, 18 months after our wedding. Its listed registered agent led back, through 2 more shell layers Desmond had spent all evening untangling, to a woman named Paige Sorensen. I knew that name. I had met her twice, briefly, at Grant's company holiday parties, introduced both times as my right hand at the office, a sharp, polished woman a few years younger than me who ran logistics for his development deals. I remembered, with a strange lurch, that at the second party, in December of 2022, she'd been wearing a beaded bracelet that looked almost exactly like the one I'd knelt in the sand for in Providenciales, and I remembered thinking, briefly and uselessly, that it was a strange coincidence before I let it go. It was not a coincidence. According to the records Desmond had pulled, Sorensen Consulting LLC had received over $300,000 in consulting fees from Grant's shell companies since 2020, none of it corresponding to any actual consulting work Desmond could verify. The money moved from Grant's development deals into the shell companies, into Sorensen Consulting, and from there into a mortgage payment on a 2-bedroom condo in South Charlotte, purchased in April of 2021, in Paige Sorensen's name alone. Property records showed a second name added to the household at that address in 2022. A child's name appeared on a daycare enrollment form Desmond had located through a records request tied to a custody filing Paige herself had made against a different man years earlier. A filing that had, strangely, listed Grant Calloway as an emergency contact. I sat on the edge of my bed at 9:40 at night with my phone lighting up my hands and understood, all at once in one sick wave, exactly what 6 years of my marriage had actually been. Grant hadn't been a controlling man who simply loved money more than he loved generosity. He had been building an entire second life, a woman and a child in a condo 20 minutes from the house I used to live in, funded by money he told me over and over he did not have to spare. Every $20 bill flung at my feet, every argument about a credit card, every tearful performance about the pressure of carrying everything alone had been a lie stacked on top of another lie, protecting a fortune he was actively pouring into another family while mine went hungry for approval and groceries both. I didn't cry that night, not right away. I sat very still and read the file twice, then a third time, memorizing dates the way Desmond had taught me to, because dates were the thing that would matter most in a courtroom. Then I called Sawyer and read him the file line by line, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "We're using this tomorrow," he said. All of it. I barely slept. I kept thinking about the folder in Grant's office, the word Sorensen in his cramped handwriting, sitting there in plain sight for a year and a half while I dusted around it, never once suspecting that the answer to every humiliation I'd swallowed was tucked between 2 hardcover books 3 feet from where he slept every night beside me. The Thursday hearing was held in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the Mecklenburg County Courthouse, a plain room with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Vivian was there, seated stiffly in the second row behind Grant, her purse held on her lap like a shield. Priya Anand sat beside Grant at the defense table, and I watched her posture the moment she opened the folder Sawyer had sent over that morning as a courtesy, required disclosure before the hearing began. Her spine went rigid. She turned and said something to Grant in a low, urgent voice, and I watched the color drain out of his face in real time, watched him turn to look at her like she'd slapped him. Sawyer built the case methodically. He started with the offshore account, the shell company's 6 years of undisclosed income totaling, by Desmond's final tally, $540,000. He walked the judge through each transfer with a patience that felt almost surgical. Dates lined up against dates. Deposits cross-referenced against the very quarters Grant had told me, at our kitchen island, that money was too tight to spare for a credit card. Grant Grant sat through that portion with his jaw locked, staring straight ahead, the posture of a man absorbing a loss he still believed he could recover from. Priya took notes without looking up, her pen moving faster the longer the numbers went on. Then Sawyer said, "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence documentation regarding Sorensen Consulting LLC." I watched Grant's head turn, slow and mechanical, toward our table. For the first time in 6 years of marriage, I watched real fear cross his face. Not performed fear, not the wounded, drowning man fear he'd used on me over kitchen islands and breakfast tables, but something raw and unrehearsed. Sawyer laid it out plainly. The LLC, the condo, the mortgage payments, the child's daycare enrollment, the emergency contact filing. He didn't editorialize. He didn't need to. The numbers did the work themselves, the way Desmond always said they would. Behind me, I heard Vivian make a sound I'd never heard a grown woman make before, something between a gasp and a sob, cut off almost immediately, like she was trying to swallow it back down. "Mrs. Calloway," the judge said, addressing Priya, "does your client wish to respond?" Grant stood up before Priya could answer for him, which she clearly hadn't wanted him to do. "This is not what it looks like," he said, his voice too loud for the room. "Paige is an employee. The consulting fees were legitimate business expenses. I don't know anything about a child's enrollment. That has nothing to do with me." "Mr. Calloway," the judge said, "you're listed as an emergency contact on a custody filing associated with that address." Grant's mouth opened and closed. For the first time since I'd known him, I watched him have nothing to say. I asked Sawyer beforehand if I could speak directly, and he'd told me judges rarely allow it during a financial hearing unless invited. But if the moment came, to keep it short and let the facts carry the weight rather than the anger. The judge unusually turned to me near the end and asked if I had anything I wanted to add to the record. I stood up. My hands were steady in a way that surprised me. "For 6 years," I said, "my husband told me there wasn't enough money for me to have a credit card, a savings account, or even $60 for groceries without asking him for it, sometimes on my knees, in front of his friends, because he liked to throw it at my feet instead of handing it to me. He told me this while paying for a second household 20 minutes from ours. He let his own mother believe I was the one destroying this family." I looked at Vivian then, just once, not with cruelty, just so she'd know I saw her. "I'm not asking this court for revenge. I'm asking for what was legally mine this entire time. Money I have documentation showing he hid, in accounts I never had access to, while telling me I should be grateful for what fell on the floor." The courtroom was silent for a long moment. Grant wouldn't look at me. Priya had her hand pressed flat against her forehead, the universal gesture of a lawyer watching a case she can no longer win slip fully out of reach. The judge thanked me and said the court would take a recess to review the new evidence before issuing further orders regarding asset division and, separately, referring the matter to the appropriate agency, given the apparent unreported income. Outside in the hallway during the recess, Holton Marsh approached me, the same man who had whistled and laughed the night Grant threw $60 at my feet in front of him. He looked smaller in the fluorescent courthouse light than he ever had in our living room. "I didn't know," he said, "about any of it. The other woman. I swear I didn't know, Mara." I believed him about the affair. I didn't tell him that I didn't need his absolution for the part he had known about, the part where he'd laughed while I knelt on my own kitchen floor. I just nodded and walked past him to find a bench where I could sit down before my legs stopped agreeing to hold me up. The weeks after the hearing moved fast in some places and painfully slow in others. The court froze the assets tied to the shell companies pending a full audit, and Grant's development firm, already stretched thin from 2 projects that had gone over budget that year, lost its primary institutional investor within 11 days of the story reaching the local business press. A reporter for the Charlotte Business Journal had gotten hold of the court filings, public record by then, and ran a piece with the headline, "Developers' Hidden Assets Include Second Household, Undisclosed Income." Once one outlet ran it, 2 more picked it up within the week. Grant's name, the one people used to say like it meant something, started meaning something very different at every dinner table in the industry. Vivian called me in December, 6 weeks after the hearing. I almost didn't answer. When I did, her voice sounded older than I remembered it, thinner. "I owe you an apology," she said, and I let her sit in the silence for a moment before I said anything back. "I told you separate money meant a marriage was already halfway to divorce. I told you Harold and I never kept anything from each other. That wasn't true, Mara. Harold kept things from me my whole life. Small things, big things, and I called it love because I didn't know what else to call 34 years of my own silence. I taught my son how to do exactly what his father did to me. I am so sorry." I told her I appreciated her saying it, and I meant it, though appreciation and forgiveness are not the same thing, and I wasn't ready yet to promise her the second one. What she'd said about a grandchild she never knew existed. A boy, I later learned, not yet 3 years old, kept in a condo 20 minutes from her own home, had clearly broken something in her that no apology to me could fully repair. My sister Dana became the person I called every single night that fall, sometimes just to say nothing at all, just to have someone breathing on the other end of the line while I sat in my new apartment surrounded by boxes I still hadn't fully unpacked. She'd flown up from Savannah twice, once right after I left Grant and once during the week of the hearing, and both times she'd shown up with groceries she'd bought and paid for herself, sliding the receipt across the counter to me without a word, just so I'd know, without either of us saying it out loud, that money could be handed to a person without being thrown at them. Colton and Beckett both distanced themselves from Grant Grant within the month, not out of loyalty to me, I think, but out of the particular self-preservation of men who suddenly understood that laughing along with someone could someday look, on paper, like complicity. I heard through Dana, who'd heard it through a mutual friend, that Beckett had told someone at a different poker game that he always thought something was off about the way Grant treated her, a sentence that arrived 8 months and one public scandal too late to mean much of anything, though I noted it anyway, the way you note the weather after a storm has already passed through and torn up everything it was going to tear up. Grant made 2 desperate moves in the months that followed, both of which made his situation worse. In December, he tried to transfer the remaining balance from one of the Delaware shell companies into a new account before the court-ordered freeze could catch it, a move Desmond flagged within days by monitoring the exact accounts he'd already spent months mapping. Sawyer filed an emergency motion, and the judge, already frustrated by 2 prior order violations, held Grant in contempt and ordered the funds returned with an additional penalty. In January, Grant tried a different tactic entirely, calling me directly despite the standing protective order, not screaming this time but pleading, his voice small in a way I had genuinely never heard from him before. "I'll go to counseling," he said. "I'll fix this. Page means nothing. It was a mistake that got out of hand. I panicked. I didn't know how to undo it once it started. I still love you, Mara. Please." I recorded the call, as Sawyer had instructed me to do with any contact, and hung up without answering him, and that recording became the basis for a second violation charge that resulted in a brief suspended sentence and a formal warning that any further contact would mean jail time. Thanksgiving that year fell 3 weeks after the hearing, and it became its own small battlefield. Vivian had always hosted, every year of my marriage, a long table at her house in Myers Park with a turkey Grant carved himself, a tradition he was proud of in the specific, performative way he was proud of most things. That year, Dana called me the Tuesday before to ask carefully whether I was going, since Grant would obviously be there, and family gatherings in the Callaway orbit still technically included me on paper for a few more months. I told her I wasn't going, and she said, "Good, come to Savannah instead," and I did, and it was the first Thanksgiving in 6 years where nobody handed me anything folded, crumpled, or counted out. My brother-in-law grilled a turkey on the back porch and let me carve it myself, badly, laughing the whole time, and nobody watched to see if I did it right. Grant's firm formally dissolved its partnership structure in February after his 2 remaining institutional partners, men I'd met exactly twice at holiday parties and never once by their full names, quietly bought out his stake for a fraction of what the firm had been worth 18 months earlier. I heard about it from Colton, of all people, who texted me out of nowhere to say he thought I'd want to know. A strange, unsolicited gesture I still can't fully explain, except to guess that some part of him needed to prove to himself that he'd landed on the right side of something, even 8 months too late to matter. Grant kept the house. He sold the boat by spring. By summer, according to Dana's mutual friend, he was renting a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex off Independence Boulevard, the same brand of complex, I noted with a feeling I couldn't fully name, that I'd moved into the night I left him. There was a moment in late January, sitting alone in my apartment with a mug of tea going cold on the counter, when the anger finally gave way to something quieter and sadder underneath it. I found myself thinking not about Grant the liar, the man with the shell companies and the second condo, but about Grant the 26-year-old developer who used to call me at 9 in the morning just to hear my voice before either of us had started our day, the man who'd cried, actually cried, at our wedding when I walked down the aisle at that Asheville vineyard. I mourned him, that version of him, or maybe I mourned the version of myself who believed he was real and permanent and safe. I let myself cry about it exactly once, sitting on my kitchen floor, the same kind of floor I used to kneel on for grocery money, except this time nobody was watching and nobody was laughing, and the floor belonged entirely to me. The financial complications stretched on through the winter and into spring. Because Grant's income had been so thoroughly hidden for years, the divorce settlement required a full forensic reconstruction of 6 years of marital finances, a process Desmond described to me, half joking, as archaeology with spreadsheets. There were tax implications neither of us had anticipated. An IRS inquiry opened independently once the unreported income became a matter of public court record, and a protracted argument over the Charlotte house, which Grant wanted to keep and which I, ultimately, had no interest in fighting for, since I'd never once felt it was mine to begin with. What I did fight for, and what Sawyer secured for me in April, was 52% of the discovered marital assets, a figure the judge explicitly tied to what she called, in her written order, a documented and sustained pattern of financial control designed to obscure marital wealth from the petitioner. Paige Sorensen, for her part, was never a party to our case, though I learned secondhand that she'd left Grant's firm entirely by February and moved with her son to Georgia to be near her own family. I never spoke to her. I never wanted to. Whatever complicated grief she was carrying about the shape of her own relationship with Grant belonged to her, not to me, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't hate her. I mostly just hoped, in the detached way you hope for a stranger, that her son grew up somewhere steadier than the arrangement he'd been born into. The most unexpected ally I found in that stretch of months wasn't anyone I would have predicted. Rosalind, my old college roommate from Richmond, the one I'd canceled that weekend visit on back in 2023, reached out in early December after seeing the Business Journal piece shared by a mutual friend. I hadn't spoken to her in almost 2 years by then, and I remember staring at her message for a long time before I answered it, half expecting judgment I didn't think I had the energy to absorb. Instead, she wrote, "I always wondered why you stopped coming around. I'm not asking you to explain it. I just want you to know I have a guest room and it's yours whenever you want it." I cried reading that message in a way I hadn't cried through any part of the actual court proceedings, the specific grief of realizing how much ordinary friendship I had quietly let Grant erase from my life without ever being told directly to erase it. I started seeing a therapist myself that January, a woman named Elaine Brooks who specialized in financial abuse recovery, someone Sawyer had recommended after watching me sit through 4 months of hearings with what he later told me was an alarming amount of composure for someone who should probably be falling apart. Elaine was the first person who used the phrase coercive control in a way that made the whole shape of my marriage click into place at once, like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known was there. She told me something in our third session that I still think about. "The bills on the floor were never really about the money," she said. "They were a rehearsal. Every time you knelt down to pick them up, you were practicing believing you belonged down there. That's what he was actually training you to do." I didn't cry in that session either. I just sat with it, turning it over, understanding for the first time that the money had always been the least important part of what Grant had taken from me. The legal complications kept unspooling through the spring in ways that tested my patience more than my resolve. The IRS inquiry into Grant's unreported income dragged into a formal audit by March, and because our joint returns for 6 years had been filed based on the income he'd chosen to disclose, my own name was briefly tangled up in the review before my accountant, working alongside Desmond, successfully demonstrated that I'd had no access to or knowledge of the hidden accounts. It cost me another $1,100 in accounting fees and 3 genuinely sleepless weeks to get my name fully cleared, a small, bitter postscript to a marriage that had never let me anywhere near its actual finances until the moment those finances became a legal liability I had to personally prove I hadn't caused. The divorce was finalized in June of 2025, almost exactly 7 years after that first bracelet on the beach in Providenciales. I moved into a small house in the Plaza Midwood neighborhood that fall. Nothing extravagant, a 2-bedroom bungalow with a porch and a kitchen. I painted myself over a long weekend. Sage green, a color Grant would have called impractical, and I call mine. I built out my bookkeeping practice into a real business, incorporated, with 11 regular clients now, mostly small contractors and 2 restaurant owners who found me through referrals. The same quiet, patient work I used to do at midnight with the volume turned down so nobody would notice. Nobody has to not notice anymore. I bought myself a bracelet last spring, nothing fancy. Hand-strung beads from a woman at the Charlotte Farmers Market, $42. I paid for it myself, handed the cash across the table, and she wrapped it in tissue paper and thanked me, and I walked to my car and sat there for a minute the way I had years earlier in that driveway after the poker night, except this time the tears that came weren't from humiliation. I'm still not entirely sure what to call what I felt in that car. Something like closure. Though closure has always struck me as too tidy a word for what actually happens when you finally finish healing from something. It felt more like proof that a small, ordinary object could belong to me without first passing through someone else's hand, without landing crumpled on a floor I'd have to kneel to reach. Vivian and I talk occasionally now, not often. A phone call every month or two, careful and a little formal. 2 people rebuilding something neither of us fully trusts yet, but both seem to want anyway. She told me last winter that she'd started seeing a therapist for the first time in her life at 71 years old, and that some of what she'd unpacked in those sessions had made her look back at her own marriage to Harold with a clarity she'd spent 34 years avoiding. I don't know if we'll ever be close the way I once hoped a mother-in-law and I might be, but I no longer need her to be sorry in order for me to have moved on, and that distinction matters more than I expected it to. Dana still calls me most Sundays. Last month, she asked, gently, whether I thought I'd ever date again, and I told her honestly that I didn't know, that I wasn't in any hurry, that for the first time in almost a decade, I was mostly just interested in finding out who I was when nobody was rationing out my sense of worth in $20 increments. She laughed and said that sounded like the healthiest answer I'd ever given her about anything, and I think she's probably right. I still see Elaine every other week. We spend less time now talking about Grant specifically, and more time talking about the smaller, stranger residue he left behind. The way I still sometimes flinch when a man reaches for his wallet too quickly near me. The way I count change twice out of a habit I can't fully explain to people who never had to learn it. She tells me healing from something like this isn't a straight line, that there will be a wedding I attend someday, or a birthday dinner, where somebody's husband makes a joke about tossing cash across a table and laughs, and I'll feel my whole body go cold before my mind catches up to explain why. She's already been right about that twice. Both times, I excused myself, stood in a bathroom for 2 minutes, and went back out steadier than I expected to be. That, she tells me, is what healed actually looks like. Not the absence of the flinch, just the ability to walk back out into the room afterward. Rosalind's guest room in Richmond has become something like a second home. I've stayed there 4 times now, and last spring she finally got to take me to the restaurant I never made it to back in 2023. The one Grant decided, without asking, wasn't worth a weekend of my time. We split a bottle of wine that cost $31, and I paid for half of it myself, and neither of us thought to mention that fact out loud because by then it had stopped stopped being remarkable. That, more than the settlement, more than the courtroom, more than watching Grant's face go pale over a folder marked Sorensen, is the ending I actually wanted. Not triumph, just an ordinary Tuesday where nobody's keeping score of what I'm allowed to want. I think often about the version of that Friday night poker game where I might have just kept quiet forever, kept smiling, kept kneeling, kept telling myself it was stress, kept believing that a man who loved me the way Grant claimed to love me could really be capable of building a whole second family in a condo 20 minutes away, while I counted grocery money on a kitchen floor. I think about how close I came, some years, to simply accepting the floor as where I belonged. What finally saved me wasn't hatred, though I felt plenty of that in the months the case dragged on. It was the quiet, unglamorous discipline of an online bookkeeping course at midnight, a separate account open 20 minutes across town, and the decision, made alone, with nobody clapping for me and nobody watching, to stop waiting for someone else to hand me my own worth. I don't tell this story anymore, looking for sympathy. I tell it because I know there are other women sitting exactly where I sat, kneeling on some kitchen floor somewhere, gathering crumpled bills off the ground and telling themselves it's just stress, it's just a bad night, it'll get better. It won't, not on its own. It gets better the way mine did, slowly, secretly, methodically, with a plan built in the dark while someone else sleeps soundly beside you, certain that you'll always be there waiting on your knees for whatever falls from his hand. There's a version of grief in this story too, and I won't pretend there isn't. I lost 7 years I can't get back, a version of myself who once believed love looked like being provided for instead of being controlled, and a marriage I genuinely wanted to work even after I had every reason to walk away from it far sooner than I did. Some nights I still catch myself missing the man I thought I married, not the one who actually existed, but the one I invented out of hope and a wedding toast and a phone call at 9 in the morning. That man was never real. Mourning him anyway is not a contradiction. It's just what happens when you finally see someone clearly for the first time, and you realize the person you loved for 6 years was mostly a story you told yourself to survive the floor. I don't kneel for money anymore. I don't kneel for anything I haven't chosen to kneel for myself. And when I think back now to that October night, the chips clicking, Colton's laugh, the bills scattering across my own kitchen floor while Grant grinned like he'd told the funniest joke of his life, I don't feel the heat in my face that I felt back then. I feel something closer to distance, the particular hard-won distance of a woman who picked herself up off that floor for the last time and never had to kneel again. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the whole story, whether I ever regret how long it took me to leave, whether I wish I'd found that folder marked Sorensen sooner, whether 6 years feels like a wound or a waste. I've settled on an answer I actually believe. Every one of those years taught me something I needed in order to leave for good instead of leaving and going back, the way I know now so many women do, pulled back in by an apology that sounds sincere the first few times you hear it. I didn't leave because I finally hated Grant enough. I left because I'd finally built, quietly, dollar by hidden dollar, somewhere else to land. That's the part nobody tells you about walking away from someone who's convinced you that you're worth exactly what falls from his hand. You don't need his permission to be worth more. You just need somewhere solid enough to stand on when you finally stop waiting for him to hand it to you.